Namaskar. Today we are going to discuss about the National Disaster Management Act 2005, which was issued by Government of India. In fact, if we talk about disaster management, this is one of the very important initiatives taken by Government of India. We have seen a lot of disasters like Gujarat earthquake, Orissa super cyclone, even Kashmir, Pakistan Kashmir border earthquake. Many of the earthquakes we have seen and disasters we have seen, and out of that there was a urgent need to establish a policy framework for disaster management, and 2005 Government of India issued the National Disaster Management Act, which was passed by the Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha both in December 2005. So before starting National Disaster Management Act, a lot of initiatives at the international level also taken. In 90s we realized that most of the disasters are concentrated in developing country, and especially in Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific. Those areas are mostly turbulent by the natural disasters. In view of that, the UN agency, they called for a summit, that was the Yokohama summit, and basic objective was how to basically we can go from disaster response and recovery to the disaster preparedness and mitigation. So there was a paradigm shift in that way. Then after that, IDDRR, it was basically the initiatives of UN, United Nations, and they started working on that. Many of the initiatives were taken in all multiple disaster prone states and the countries. So after that, 2005, there was a Hugo framework for disaster management, and there basically it was the basic objective of the Hugo framework was to integrate the disaster reduction into the policy, plans, programs for sustained development and poverty alleviation. Other objectives of this Hugo framework was the member states, regional organizations, United National systems, financial institutions, NGOs to engage fully in supporting and implementing international strategy for disaster reduction and cooperate to advance integrated approach to building disaster resilient nation and the community. Also, the objective was to focus on national implementation by bilateral, regional and international coordination. Apart from that, what is the UN priority for disaster management? Few of them are like the political commitment and institutional aspects. Many of the institutes, many of the organizations have been set up by the international bodies, UN, that how better the strategic and basic disaster preparedness, mitigation, response and recovery can be done in the disaster prone areas. Then risk identification, assessment of risk, monitoring and early warnings, establishing the early warning system for disaster management. Knowledge management, this is the one of the very important aspect where it is required that how best all the stakeholders, might be your government, might be community, might be the private players, the corporate sectors, how the knowledge can be enhanced so that whatever development which is taking place by any of the agency or the department or the region or the state, they are streamlining disaster management in their development aspects. Reduction of underlying risk factors like environmental, social development or land use, and disaster preparedness and response. The other approaches are like, what is the UN approach? It is multi-approach, multi-hazard approach. Like the area might be suffering from, for 10 years, it is every year visited by the earthquake or the floods. Once we are going for interventions in terms of mitigation, not only for the floods or the earthquake we need to work. We need to work for what are the different type of hazards which is existing in the area, and how multiple hazard approach is required to be taken once we are going for planning. Then gender perspective. Still we are finding that many of the developing countries, we are not still the gender sensitive, and we require to take the women, the children in account, and that comes under the approaches about the gender sensitiveness. Community and volunteer participation. Earlier we thought and we were thinking that disaster management, it is absolutely going to be done by the government or stakeholders or public sectors, but now we have realized not only the government but the community is the foremost and key players in disaster response or any type of preparedness activities, because community is the first responder. And then capacity building, this it is very, very important. So this is the basic UN approach, and what Hugo policy framework it states about. Let us talk a bit about how our country has started looking for a very concretized, a very firm structure for disaster management. We know that till 2001 the responsibility of disaster management was with the government of India, that is the Ministry of Agriculture. But at that time only the committee was constituted by Prime Minister of India and Government of India and High Power Committee. Just before Orissa super cyclone it was established, and then all party national committee February 2001 it was done after Gujarat earthquake. Recommendations which came out of the High Power Committee is that you need to have a disaster management plan at the national level, at the state level, at the district level. Also we need to have certain apex body which can look after the disaster management. So these are the basic recommendation and very important recommendation which came out of it. Then it also recommended for National Disaster Management Act and establishing the authority for it, so that whenever there is a disaster it can be taken very seriously by the government at the national level, the state level and the district level. The responsibility of disaster management, it was transferred to Ministry of Home Affairs in 2002, and the interim arrangement was done and act was passed in 2005. Government of India set up NDMA as the national authority with chairperson as the Prime Minister, National Executive Committee comprising of secretaries of 14 ministries and Chief of Integrated Staff, Defence Staff to function as Executive Committee of National Disaster Management Authority. Disaster management structure, it was proposed at 3 levels, one at the national level, second state level and third at the district level. Also we realized that for disaster response we always take the help of armed forces, and armed forces are already, they have the responsibility for strategic security of the country, and once we are involving them in regular disaster, natural occurrence of disasters, then I think the objective will be lost. So Government of India decided that they should have a national disaster response force, and in India we are finding that Ministry of Home Affairs is having 4 paramilitary forces, and out of that particular force the resources were pooled, the people were taken out, and the National Disaster Management Authority was established. Then also there is a requirement of setting up the National Institute of Disaster Management, so that at the apex level supporting the Government of India, supporting the National Disaster Management Authority, and also advocacy can be done at the state level, at the district level. The NIDM, that is the National Institute of Disaster Management, was established. Then we have seen that many times we are facing the constraint of funds, and for that the Government of India has taken a lot of initiatives, and now not only for the response the funds is allocated, but also for the mitigation. Once the peace time, once there is a lull time, we can look for how much money is available, and for preparedness or for some sort of mitigation, what we can do. For that a mitigation fund has been established. What is the criteria of National Disaster Management Authority? Related to policy and plans. National authority shall be responsible for laying down the policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management for ensuring timely and effective response to the disasters. The main responsibility of National Disaster Management Authority is to lay down the policy and guidelines for ministries and the states covering all aspects of disaster management. In a way, suppose if there is a water resources department or there is a housing department, ministries are there. So what are their roles and responsibility? What way they should contribute towards the disaster resilient, creating a disaster resilient system? That is all guidelines is required to be given by this National Disaster Management Authority. Also, lay down the broad policy and guidelines for National Institute of Disaster Management. It is also required how better we can strengthen the National Institute of Disaster Management so that whatever it is required at the state level, at the national level, at the district level, those things can be given and imparted by National Institute of Disaster Management. Approved national plans and those prepared by ministries and departments. Also, the charter of the NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority, is to approve all plans which might have been prepared by departments, might be prepared by ministries, might be by the states. So those all plans are required to be approved by NDMA. Then coming to the what they are required to do for operational functions, might be the coordinate the enforcement and implementation of policy and plans. It might be recommend provisions of funds for mitigation and also apply the same. Take such other options for prevention of disasters or mitigation or for preparedness and capacity building. For dealing with threatening disaster situation or disaster, it may consider if necessary. General superintendence, direction and control of National Disaster Response Force shall be vested in and exercised by the NDMA. Other than that, they have provisions such as providing a support to other countries once it is affected by natural disasters, recommend guidelines for minimum standards of relief to be provided to the affected people. Still, we don't have a very clear-cut standing and framework. What is the minimum requirement of relief that is required to be given? At present, we are practicing the sphere guidelines, which is giving a very standards of food, shelter, hygiene, sanitation, water and other things like that. So that particular minimum standards are also required to be evolved by this National Disaster Management Authority. Then in case of disaster of severe magnitude, recommend relief in payment of loans or for grant of fresh loans to the person affected by disaster on such concessional terms as may be appropriate. Now just have a look on this particular framework which has been taken up from the NDMA guidelines. In fact, if you see the National Disaster Management structure, at the top the Government of India is there. If you go down, you will be finding the National Disaster Management Authority with National Executive Council Committee. It is there. But if you see how they are linked up, they are also linked up with the Cabinet Committee on Management of Natural Calamities, National Crisis Management Committee, Cabinet Committee on Security, National Institute of Disaster Management, and also Ministry of Home Affairs and other departments, ministries. They are linked up with the National Disaster Management Authority. They have the National Disaster Mitigation Resource Centers, National Disaster Response Force. Now, National Disaster Mitigation Resource Center, there are certain centers or the institutions, organizations which have been identified by Government of India. They are at the time of requirement, they can provide certain advocacy, they can provide certain consultancy, they can provide certain advice to the National Disaster Management Authority. If we go down, we are finding the state authorities are there. And at the same time, the state authority is having the State Executive Committee, which is looking after all plans and all policies which is approved by the NDMA or STMA. They are going to implement it. And if you see, the armed forces are also attached to this state authority and national authority, and district level you are finding the District Disaster Management Authority. In that, You will be finding the local bodies, how they are involved, district disaster management authorities are there, district administrations are there, and you will be finding they all are linked up at different levels. Corporate sectors are there, professional bodies are there, non-government organizations are there, academic institutions are there who are primarily involved in scientific and technological development. So this is the basic coordination at the vertical level and horizontal level. It exists for national disaster management structure. If you go down further, you will be finding the community at large. They are there, and all the activities what we are taking, it is all happening for the community. If you see the disaster management plan and act, so act spells out, and act has been already it has been enacted, and that can be downloaded from the website also of the National Disaster Management Authority. And if you see that, you will be finding there are 11 chapters, and all chapters are particularly describing, explaining the roles and responsibility of different level of authority, that is the national authority, a state authority, district authority, might be the urban local bodies, national disaster management, National Institute of Disaster Management, National Disaster Response Force, what are the funding problems they have, what are the miscellaneous issues which comes every time once the disaster takes place. So those things are comprehensively discussed in the chapters of the National Disaster Management Act. If you see the chapter 1, it talks about the short title, extent and commencement, what are the different definitions of the terms, like what is disaster, what is preparedness, and so other things. It has been discussed in that. But second chapter, it seriously discusses about the structure of National Disaster Management Authority, when the authority can call meeting, what will be the officers required for authority, powers and functions of national authority, constitution of national members, executive committees, subcommittees, and power and function of National Executive Committee, what should be the format of national plans, guidelines for minimum standards, relief of loan of payment. So these all things will be discussed in the chapter 2. And chapter 3 talks about the State Disaster Management Authority. Similar to the first one, they also have the what will be the basic structure of State Disaster Management Authority, how many members will be there, when they can meet for discussions and review meetings, appointment of officers who will be providing all support to that state authorities, power of state authority, guidelines for minimum standards, for relief, constitution of state executive committees, how we can make the state plans, what will be the power and functions of the state executive committee in the event of threatening disaster situation. Similar to that, at the district level also we are finding that same structure, how the disaster management plan structure should be there, what will be the members, how who are the people going to be involved as a executive committee, who will be the representative from the which department. These all things are discussed in state district disaster management authority. Then what measures are going to be taken by the government, either it's a national government, either a state government or local district administration. Chapter 6 focuses on the local authority, how local authority is going to support the district disaster management authority and the state disaster management authority. National Institute of Disaster Management, what will be the charter of National Institute of Disaster Management, and who are going to support that particular NIDM, and what will be the function, objectives of that particular NIDM. It has been discussed in chapter 7. Chapter 8 speaks about National Disaster Management Force. We have already discussed about that what is the basic objective and role of National Disaster Response Force, and it has been constituted by Government of India, taking out the resources from 4 paramilitary forces, and the basic objective of NDRF is to, during the peace time, like before disaster, they are primarily involved in capacity building of the stakeholders, community, and once the disaster comes, with all resources they start going to the affected areas and just saving, search and rescue, saving people, providing all necessary assistance to the district administration and the community as well. So this is talked about in the 8th chapter about National Disaster Response Force. In chapter 9, finance, accounts and audit, those what are the basic problems which the people are facing once the disaster response is over. So how we can sort it out all the problems. Then national mitigation funds have been established, national response fund is there, who are going to release and sanction those amounts. Those all things are discussed in this particular chapter 9. And also it is required not only the central government and the state government will be providing funds for disaster response, but also it is essentially required that all state departments, all national ministries, they have to provide certain fundings for their own operations, for their own projects. So that is going to be discussed in that allocation of funds by ministries and the departments. Emergency procurement and accounting, because many times few things are required which is not available and you have to buy and the heads are not available in your accounts. So for that what provisions have been made, that is discussed in chapter 9. Then comes offences and penalties, because many times we are finding that once the disaster has taken place and people are providing certain support, there are some miscreants who are not supporting that activity. So for that the penalties and offences are already registered, and the chapter 10 talks about the same thing. Then in few of them are the punishment for obstruction, punishment for false claim, maybe that is compensation has been given and someone has claimed falsely, so those for punishment is there for them. Punishment for misappropriation of money or material, punishment for false warning, sometimes rumors are raised that disaster is going to come and people are in panic. So if such type of situation is found, the people who are responsible, they can be penalized for it. Failure of officer on duty during the disasters, penalty for contravention of any order regarding requisitioning, offences by companies, previous sanctions of prosecution and cognizance of offences. So these are things which have been discussed in chapter 10. If you see the last chapter, it talks many other issues, that is the prohibition against the discrimination, gender biases, payment for compensation. So those issues are also been discussed in that particular thing. So this is the basic chapters of National Disaster Management Act 2005, and what are the brief things which has been discussed, I have spelled it out. Now let us see that what is the structure at the national level. At the national level, chairman is the Prime Minister, and there is a group of 9 members. There is advisory committee and National Executive Committee is there. In members, there are 9 members, and one will be vice chairman, which will be nominated by the Prime Minister and who will look after all the activities of the National Disaster Management Authority. Then advisory committee will be there, who will be providing all advice to the National Disaster Management Authority, and executive committee, whatever the plan which has been sanctioned, which has been approved by member or the National Disaster Management Authority, they are in process of applying those things in the field. So if you see the chairman, the Secretary of Ministry of Home Affairs, he is the executive committee chairman, and there are 14 members ministries, and represented the secretaries representing those ministries, they are the members of that particular National Executive Committee. At the same time, if you come to the state level, you will be finding the Chief Minister is the chief of that, and members are the 8 members, and 1 member is the vice chairman, and who will be nominated by the Chief Minister. And similar to the national level structure, you will be having the advisory committee and a state executive committee. And a state executive committee, the chairperson will be the chief secretary, and there will be 4 secretaries working as a member in the state executive committee. Similar to that, state district, they are also having the chairperson, the collector is the chairman, and co-chairman is the elected representative of local authority or the ZP, CEO, SP, that is the superintendent of police, CMO and chief medical officer, and 2 other district officers which will be nominated by the collector, and they will be working as a member. And district executive committee, the chairperson will be the RDC or additional collector. So this is the basic structure we have seen at the national level, state level and district level. So this is the basic we have discussed about what is the National Disaster Management Act, what are the current initiatives which has been taken by the UN bodies, what the state is doing, what the country is doing, and what will be the structure of disaster management at the district level. We have discussed about it. Various aspects of the act we have discussed in this particular lecture. Thank you very much.